Good evening, everybody. Very nice to see so many people here. I think we're in for a very good evening. As you can see from behind me, this event is hosted jointly by the War Studies Department at King's College London, which needs no introduction in this place. Highly distinguished department, very flourishing at the moment. The Council on Christian Approaches to Defence and Disarmament, in case not everybody here is familiar with it, was founded in the darkest days of the Cold War to bring together Christians of different views on nuclear weapons to try to have a serious, rational discussion on the subject. And it brought together people at the highest possible level. Continues in existence, and it continues to engage with issues of military force, and includes within its membership, as I say, people of very, very different views. And in fact, a couple of years ago, they brought out a book of essays on this subject of Trident. Now, the format this evening is a debate on should Trident be replaced. It's necessary for me to explain quite clearly what is meant by the terms of the motion. What it means is that new boats will be built, but the present missile system will be kept. That's what it means. New boats will be built, but the present missile system will be kept. That is the debate which we're engaged in this evening. Now, I've been asked to try to sound out opinion before I introduce the speakers. If I could have a show of hands, please, for all those who believe that Trident should be replaced in the sense that I have defined it. Hands up, please. I'll give a rough count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, about 50, I think. Now, those who don't think it should be replaced. Oh, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 19, 20. Again, I think it's even Stevens. It's going to be very difficult unless we waste a lot of time counting. But it's interesting. We are roughly divided, equally divided, which is a very healthy sign for the evening. Now, we're very lucky this evening to have two distinguished speakers. The format will be each of them will speak for 20 minutes on the motion, and then we will open up for the floor to make your contributions. Feel free to do so, but please keep them short and to the point. And then at the end, our two speakers will have the last 3 or 4 minutes to make their points or respond to people, points that people have made. There'll be a final vote, and then I believe there's drinks for the winners, whoever the winners are. First of all, Lord George Robertson has held two very distinguished public positions, as we know, Secretary of State for Defence and Secretary General of NATO, a role in which he was much respected. And one of the signs of that respect is that if you look at his who's who, it contains about 13 lines of foreign orders, decorations, knighthoods, goodness knows what else. He does, of course, come from Scotland, and he has one of the highest distinctions in Scotland to be a Knight of the Thistle. And if that all sounds too serious, if you look at his publications list in Who's Who, it says Islay and Jura photographs. So we know what he's doing when he's not thinking about questions of international relations and military strategy. And on my left is Rebecca Johnson, who is Vice Chair of CND, as both the founder and the director of Acronym. She herself, I think, will spell out exactly what Acronym means, but what it involves is researching into nuclear weapons and how we can disarm and move to a nuclear-free world. So without more ado, can I ask you, please, Lord Robertson, to address us?
Are we going over there?
Oh, wait. Yes, I think it would be helpful if you went over there, if you'd like to.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop. It's always nice to have a bishop introducing you. However many orders I've got, they don't include honorary bishoprics. This is going to be closer. Used to have generals to do that for me, but times change. And if I wasn't Scottish, I might be really intimidated by the quality of the audience that is in front of me here, judging by those that I recognise in it and the authority with which they have. But anyway, I don't easily get intimidated. As the chairman has said, we're talking here about continuing the Trident missile system and Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. I've had the advantage of having been on both sides of this argument. I grew up on the Firth of Clyde, and was at school when the American Polaris base, located there in 1961, in the mists of time and history. And I used to parade, to the irritation of my father, who was in the local police and was also called George Robertson, parade with banners saying "ban the bomb," and believe very fervently at that point that if Britain led by example and got rid of its independent nuclear deterrent, as well as getting rid of the American system on the Clyde, then it would set in train a benevolent reaction that would lead to a nuclear-free world. So I was to go on in my political life to be in charge of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, and actually to be Secretary General of the NATO alliance, which relies in the final analysis on nuclear security. So that was, in some ways, a bit of a rite of passage. But to have seen the argument from both sides has given me a very considerable advantage. I grew out very quickly of the idea that we could lead by example and that people would follow us, because since the end of the Cold War, huge reductions have been made in the arsenals of the United States, of Russia, and of Britain and France, with all the de-targeting, de-alerting and confidence-building measures that have taken place among the P5 powers. However, it did absolutely nothing at all to stop India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel acquiring nuclear weapons, Iraq and Iran to want them, with only the threat of an Iraq-style invasion forcing Colonel Gaddafi to disclose and to destroy his potential acquisitions as well. And then when I was Defence Secretary of this country, and a number of those who assisted with that project here tonight, I was responsible for the biggest act of unilateral nuclear disarmament that this country has ever seen. Very substantial reductions in Britain's nuclear weapons stock. And it led to absolutely no reciprocation at all. And today the Chinese are substantially increasing its nuclear forces. Russia is upgrading its strategic nuclear capability. And of course others are both acquiring and seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. So there was absolutely no chain reaction, no benign reversal of proliferation. And it wasn't, and I think this is important to notice, it was not because the Permanent Five in the Security Council had in some way abrogated their responsibilities under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. Because actually the rationalizations for those countries acquiring and seeking nuclear weapons had absolutely nothing to do with what we were doing as well. Of course, proliferation is indeed dangerous. It's risky, it's expensive, and it's worrying, but it's a different issue to deterrence. Ballistic missile technology is spreading, and so are chemical and biological weapons and the knowledge to make them, but they're unrelated to nuclear deterrence by the major powers. So this is the rub that is before the British people today, before the British Parliament. Do we give up, without any condition or reciprocation, Britain's nuclear deterrent? And that's what the debate about Trident is all about. Because there isn't any cheap, safe, effective alternative way for Britain to stay with deterrence. Only Trident, with one of its 4 submarines on continuous patrol, unseen, undetectable and invulnerable, can guarantee that no enemy or adversary of ours or our allies will miscalculate and can believe that it can win a conventional war. So if we end the Trident system, or effectively end it by choosing not to continue with it by building new submarines, then we will be out of the business effectively forever. To try and recreate it in the face of any emerging new threat to us would take at least 20 years to do, as well as at huge cost. So we're in deterrence with Trident, or we irrevocably give it up for good and give up the independent deterrent. So in a volatile and a fractious and a highly unpredictable world, to take such a momentous decision on behalf, as it would be, of future generations, would, and I put it to you with enormous seriousness, be a profoundly irresponsible step to take. Nuclear deterrence is stable, understandable, and it's successful. For about 70 years it has prevented the kind of great power wars which disfigured the 20th century, and indeed many centuries before it. And who is going to dare to predict the nature of this world and the risks in it and the threats that will be involved in it in the next 30 to 40 years, when the renewed Trident is going to be in service? After all, how many people predicted that there would be an Arab Spring last year? And those who did predict it, who predicted it would start with Tunisia and with Egypt? How many people predicted the suddenness with which the Berlin Wall came down? How many people thought that the Soviet Union would disintegrate only 30 months after the Soviets were expelled from Afghanistan? So it's really precious few pundits who can actually tell us what it's going to be like in the future. We didn't imagine that a bunch of terrorists would fly 2 civil airliners into the Twin Towers in New York. Very few people predicted that the Warsaw Pact would collapse, and that all but one of the Warsaw Pact countries would actually today now be full members of both the European Union and of the NATO alliance. And who thought that Saddam was going to invade Kuwait, and that tiny, starving North Korea would launch a ballistic missile over Japanese airspace? So who among us tonight and in the wider country would say hand on heart that they know that there will be no enemy, no threat to us or our allies emerging or maturing over the next 40 years? Would you say that? Could you say it? Would anybody dare to say it? In a world of permanent surprises, is this the time to make a once-in-a-lifetime choice to abandon our deterrent and leave nuclear deterrence to the Americans and to the French? So that's the real issue before us tonight, and it's the real issue that is before the Parliament of this country today. Now, I just think that we need to focus. If somehow we were able to give up nuclear deterrence and create benign circumstances whereby India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, and the other putative nuclear states were to give up their weapons, and it's a heroic assumption, if we were to find some method of inspection that would make sure that was going to be enforced, then is that going to be safer? Is that actually genuinely going to be better? Was the world before nuclear weapons invented such a brave model that we could go back to that kind of model in the future? Again, 160 million people died in conflict in the 20th century. 160 million people died. Hardly any of them from nuclear war, from nuclear weapons at all. So it's not a question of nuclear weapons killing people. We've got plenty of other ways in the world of doing that as well. I think that we need to work on methods and systems and circumstances in the world that would make nuclear weapons redundant, and we're not yet at that point. But the young guy who marched at Adnadam Pier in 1961 and held a banner saying "ban the bomb" still believes that that is the right thing to do, and we need to seek a world where that can be possible to do. Trident is not a war-fighting instrument. If Trident is used, then deterrence has failed. It's a political statement. It's designed to stop an aggressor even thinking that he can win a conventional war. And the world is a safer place with the silent submarines out there under the oceans, because the usual risk-taking and national gambling of centuries of conflict that preceded it would today inflict. They are impossible to conceive when an adversary would know that to take that kind of reckless action that was so prevalent before would lead to immeasurable damage to the aggressor himself. It would not be worth taking the risk, and nobody has done so for over 6 decades in this country. So we live in an unpredictable and complex world. Power is shifting from the west to the east, from the north to the south, from stable nation-states, even from stable ideological groupings, to a world where fragile and failing states spread instability and terror and migration and violence, piracy and crime into new unstable neighbourhoods. So is this the time of all times to step into the unknown by giving up the British deterrent, which since the end of the Second World War has helped to end major power interstate warfare? I say to you, it is not the time to do it, and to do it would be highly irresponsible. I rest my case.
Lord Robertson has been extremely generous in disciplining himself so well, which means that there will be that much more opportunity for people from the floor to make their points. Now it is Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca, we're very glad to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Lord Harris, and I'd like to thank you for chairing us and carrying us through this process, and also very much to thank King's College and CCADD for holding this debate and for inviting both myself and Lord Robertson to engage. So the question before us is, should Trident be replaced? And as we've heard from Lord Robertson, the main reasons for replacing Trident focus on deterrence and security. And we've also heard from many politicians, from Tony Blair to David Cameron, who call these nuclear weapons an insurance policy against unknown and uncertain future threats. And then there are other, perhaps more real politique reasons that occasionally surface when you're discussing these with people from the armed forces and indeed from the Ministry of Defence. There's the default argument. We should have the default argument, we have them, so why give them up? There are worries about how not replacing Trident might affect Britain's relationship, particularly with the United States, and the balance of power in Europe with France and Germany, with the concurrent assumption that our giving them up would not change the nature of the debate that, after all, has never really been had in France. There is the fear that some express, and many express behind closed doors, that Britain might lose standing in the world if we were no longer a nuclear weapon state. And we're told that replacing Trident is important for Britain's role in the world, and also that nuclear weapons are good value for money, or even more crudely, bigger bangs for the buck. I want to look at all of these, but in different ways, and I'm not going to spend very much time talking about the money. The government says 20 billion to replace just the submarines, and as you've been told, that's what we're supposed to only look at today. But the truth of the matter is, it isn't just about replacing the boats. We don't for certain know what kind of missiles the US is going to be developing to replace its current Trident missiles. We are dependent on their missiles, and they are actually undergoing a rethink about what they need. And so just as in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Americans decided to upgrade from the Trident 1, the C4 to the D5, Trident 2, we may find ourselves, whether we would want to or not, having to change what we thought we were having. And then we also know that there's a lot of upgrading being done at Aldermaston and Burfield, the atomic weapons establishment, and that, whether we like it or not, there are already some design modifications underway and planned. Britain would intend to do that without nuclear testing. We're not going to violate our commitment to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But this is not just about replacing the boats. However, they say it's 20 billion. The Lib Dems in 2007 crunched the numbers, and they came up with 76 billion to replace Trident. Now, they were including some costs of deployment, warhead manufacture, and paying the US for the missiles. Greenpeace and CND have crunched the numbers, and they came up with around about £100 billion for replacing Trident. And that doesn't even count decommissioning and waste storage. Now, I'll leave you to judge what else could be done with that money. We are all being economically squeezed, and some would prefer the money to go into education and health. Others, like serving and retired members of the armed forces, including very senior officers like Lord Ramsbottom and Lord Bramall, will tell you what our armed services really need in the 21st century. And it isn't Trident. That much was made clear by that unseemly row that broke out just after the coalition government took office, and George Osborne said that the MOD was going to have to foot the whole bill for Trident. What you saw then was what many in the Ministry of Defence and certainly the armed forces really think. It's a Gucci handbag. If you give it to them on top of everything else, of course they'll say thank you, and they'll carry on with it. But if you offer it to them instead of an entire winter wardrobe of clothes and things that they need, they'll say no thanks. They don't want to pay for it, and they didn't. And so some other agreement had to be done to make sure that the capital costs would be borne by the Treasury because, as we heard from Lord Robertson, it's essentially a political device. So, nor do I want to waste precious minutes on that shallow truism that getting rid of Trident would be a problem for our relationship with the US and, would change the nature of the relationship with the US and France. The fact is that it would change the relationship. It would change the relationship with many other countries, but it should not be assumed that that would be to our disadvantage. And the key question would be on the key determinant on how such relationships would change would depend on how we use or would use such a decision. Nor am I going to rest my argument on the immorality of nuclear weapons. Undoubtedly, anyone who has spoken to survivors or seen pictures of the aftermath of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings can understand that through the immense blast, heat, and radiation effects, they caused immense and indiscriminate suffering. However, I recognize that if, and it is a very big if, our possession of nuclear weapons actually prevented their use, prevented others getting or using them, if Trident deterred not just the use of nuclear weapons, but major war, then for some that would constitute a moral case for getting, keeping, and replacing nuclear weapons. If an evidence-based, fact-based case could be sustained that Trident could actually do, and continue to do, without accident, mishap, provocation, proliferation, promotion, or the risk of failure, that job of deterrence that we just heard about against war, existential and nuclear threats of use, then morality would not be a decider, and the cost would be irrelevant. That's the nuclear advocate's hope, belief, and I'm afraid it's a fantasy. What of the real world? Many claims have been made for nuclear deterrence which may or may not have held water in the Cold War. The point for this debate on whether Trident should be replaced is whether the claims have relevance for British and international security in the 21st century. I argue they don't, and that they are actually counterproductive for our security. This was the driver behind arguments made by Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, the so-called Four Horsemen, in their first Wall Street op-ed in 2007, when they argued publicly that reliance on nuclear weapons for deterrence was, quote, becoming increasingly hazardous and decreasingly effective. Does anyone, end quote, does anyone seriously think that Kissinger et al. Suddenly became peaceniks? No. They were making a security argument for getting rid of nuclear weapons because they don't deter the real threats the US, and Britain for that matter, face. But as we've seen from the nuclear programs of recent proliferators like Pakistan and North Korea, and our concerns about Iran, nuclear deterrence arguments are dangerously attractive for weak or despotic governments who believe that just a few nuclear weapons will bring them benefits, be they security, political, and also financial. We've seen how nuclear blackmail can also be used to get aid by North Korea, since regardless of how many weapons the US, Russia, or China might have in their arsenals, these governments are, to a greater or lesser degree, somewhat risk-averse. Now, with this august audience, I can't help remembering Sir Michael Quinlan, who became a good friend in later years. Regarded as one of the most distinguished defence strategists of his generation and a former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Defence, he and I had many arguments about this issue. And I was sitting too along from him when he told the Foreign Affairs Committee that if Britain did not already have nuclear weapons, we would not consider getting them. Now, this is extraordinary if you stop to think about it. We might as well replace Trident because of default. Now, if default is the impulse, then costs may well matter. Don't we need to think about the costs and opportunity costs? I'm not only thinking about money, but about global efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation, about the need to strengthen the role, the credibility, the machinery, the effectiveness of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its regime, in which the nuclear weapon states committed to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith, and in 2000 negotiated a series of steps and made the, quote, unequivocal undertaking to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals. What Britain, and other nuclear-armed states, of course, but this debate is about Trident, what Britain does with its nuclear weapons affects the credibility of the non-proliferation regime. This is not just about numbers or reducing alert status. Salami slicing down to lower numbers is of course better than retaining huge arsenals, and the massive unilateral nuclear disarmament steps that took place at the end of the Cold War were very much welcomed, but we also have to recognize the underlying causes for them. But the key to preventing proliferation now and for the future is for the role and value attached to nuclear weapons to be reduced. So when UK government leaders say that Trident plays an indispensable role in Britain's defence and security, what signals are they sending to leaders that have far greater direct threats on their borders? Hanging on to Trident is not a cost-free, risk-free, might-as-well default. When a country such as Britain says in 2012 that we need to replace Trident, this signals that for all the rhetoric about wanting a nuclear weapons-free world, we won't be doing anything ourselves to reduce our reliance on these weapons of mass destruction. Yet in UN Security Council Resolution 1887 from September 2009 and the 2010 NPT Review Conference, we negotiated and adopted commitments that are incompatible with replacing Trident. We've committed not only to undertake concrete disarmament efforts and specific steps and measures, but also we've agreed to clauses that agreements that affirm that all states need to make special efforts to establish the necessary framework to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. Replacing Trident because we already have it or are worried about the French, those aren't good enough reasons. There are high costs and opportunity costs attached to keeping on with nuclear business as usual. Do we think they're going to deter the terrorists? Even Tony Blair acknowledged that nuclear weapons do not deter terrorists. Do we think they're going to deter Russia? We're very concerned about the way in which Russia may be revaluing its nuclear weapons. But when we talk about deterrence, we also have to look at the real world and look at intention as well as capability. A nuclear status quo of current haves and have-nots is simply not the option that we face. If Britain decides to go ahead with the next generation of Trident or Trident Light, we will lose a unique opportunity to influence the nuclear decision-making and security decision-making of others, and we will help to undermine international law and the NPT. Now, we heard the arguments that whatever we did, we reduced our numbers and so on, it didn't have an impact on potential proliferators or on the decision-making of India, Pakistan, and so on. And within this current regime, that's largely true. And one of the reasons why that's true is because there are two very different discourses that are going past each other. There's ours, which is salami-slicing numbers, but maintaining a high role, high salience, high value for the nuclear weapons that we have left. Such a high value that we're prepared to spend billions of pounds on getting the next generation. And then there's the narrative on the other side, which recognizes that at the end of the Cold War, it isn't the numbers, it's small numbers of nuclear weapons. It's the value, it's the role assigned to them. And therefore, this is something that is not going to be affected by us changing, our notice to fire, or changing our operational status, or shaving off a few warheads here, maybe even a Trident boat. There can only be affected if we clearly identify that we do not need nuclear weapons in this world, that the security threats we face are not ones that nuclear weapons can do anything about. So there won't be a simplistic or directly sequential follow my leader kind of response, but in deeper political ways, choosing not to replace Trident would amplify the work of a growing number of non-nuclear or even nuclear alliance countries like Norway, Germany, Switzerland, South Africa, Austria, Egypt, Indonesia, to build more assured security relations and ban nuclear weapons, bolstering deterrence against use by reinforcing the taboo with legal and political recognition that any use of nuclear weapons would constitute a crime against humanity and war crime. And then Britain's technological knowledge of how nuclear weapons are built would then be invaluable in creating the most effective verification regime possible. Instead of being the first to unilaterally kick President Obama and others' objectives of a world free of nuclear weapons down the road, Britain could use Trident in one last but effective and security-enhancing way to announce its renunciation and give a huge boost to multilateral efforts to ban nuclear weapons and build a much more sustainable nuclear security and anti-proliferation regime to prevent the realistic nuclear risks and dangers of today. So we cannot keep clinging on to a comfort blanket where there is no real evidence. There's only assertion, voodoo assertion, for the role that these weapons might play in any future security situation. To conclude, in arguing that Britain should not replace Trident and should furthermore take the current unnecessary fleet off patrol pending decommissioning, I do not pretend it will be easy or that this will solve all our problems. We have some very shaky days ahead and will need to work together on solving a range of economic, educational and security challenges, not just within this one nation, but across nations, together. Whatever we do about Trident, we will have to face those changes. Replacing Trident just takes away some of the resources for more essential priorities. A key question for a debate like this is, what do nuclear weapons do for us? Not deterrence, not status, not a cheap or useful force equalizer, since we still need to equip our armed forces for other missions. Who would our politicians and our submarine commanders, for that matter, target if our faith in nuclear deterrence is proved wrong? We all know that the major security threats in the world are transboundary, global problems, from terrorism to global warming and climate chaos. Replacing Trident is worse than irrelevant for those threats, and at worst, these nuclear weapons impede, they get in the way of multilateral and global security efforts undertaken by others. Do we want to be that country that incinerates millions of innocent people, even in retaliation, when deterrence has failed? Such acts would still be crimes against humanity. Do we want to ignite or fail to prevent a regional nuclear war with catastrophic humanitarian consequences like agricultural collapse and global famine? Getting rid of Trident should not be despite a future that is uncertain, but because of the uncertainties that lie ahead in our future. Trident is a security problem for us now and even more so for us in the future. It is not an asset. Having it did not prevent wars or near misses like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis or the 1983 Able Archer miscalculation. Nuclear weapons did not stop Britain, France, Russia, and even the US from declining economically and politically over the decades since 1945, nor are China and India's rise to prominence attached to their having nuclear forces, although the equation that certainly India made was one of the drivers that led them to explode the nuclear tests and declare they were a nuclear weapon state in 1998, which has resulted in increased security and nuclear threats in their own subcontinent, because Pakistan followed very quickly after, and now they are engaged in a nuclear arms race. If we make an intelligent decision not just not to replace Trident, but to use this to become the first nuclear weapon state under the NPT to fully comply with our international legal obligations, and in so doing to greatly increase efforts being undertaken by many other nations to devalue and delegitimize nuclear weapons altogether, and to pursue multilateral disarmament and end proliferation drivers, we might gain some of the standing that we hanker after. Even that isn't a certainty, since nuclear weapons were irrelevant to the reasons why Britain has lost standing and influence. We will still have to work in all sorts of other ways to exert influence, build security, prevent wars and conflicts, and do the right thing. Or do we want to be the country that wakes up to the real 21st century world, takes a brave, rational, humanitarian, security, and, yes, moral step away from collective Cold War voodoo and 19th century colonialist mindsets to help actively create the conditions for building better security through a verifiable ban on nuclear weapons and draw all the other nuclear-armed and nuclear proliferant states towards building that goal of security in a world without nuclear weapons. I think we can do that, but not if we replace Trident.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. We've had another clear and forceful statement. We've been very well served at the beginning of our debate. It is now open to the floor. If you'd like to speak, put your hand up and wait for the microphone to come to you, and if you could say who you are and make your points as briefly as possible. Anybody like to begin with their contribution? There's a gentleman there. David, is there any water? Oh, yes. So here's some water.
My name is Julian Lewis. I'm a Member of Parliament, and I used to debate these issues with the CND in the 1980s. I would like to thank both speakers for making such a clear case, and I'd particularly like to thank Rebecca for acknowledging that those of us who feel that a nuclear deterrent is necessary to prevent a war that might otherwise happen have a moral force on our side, just as those people who feel that getting rid of nuclear weapons for the same reason have a moral force on their side. At that time in the 1980s, the late Sir Peter Blaker was Armed Forces Minister, and he always used to say that whenever he asked someone in favour of unilateral or one-sided nuclear disarmament to name a specific nuclear or near-nuclear country that would either give up its existing arsenal or stop seeking to acquire nuclear weapons if it didn't already have them, no answer was ever forthcoming. So I'd like to ask Rebecca which nuclear or near-nuclear countries she thinks would give up their nuclear weapons or stop seeking them if we gave up ours. And finally, I'd just like to say, it's all well and good to say these are not the issues facing us now in the 21st century. The problem is we're only a few years into the 21st century, and we have no way of knowing that the issues that are facing us now will be the same issues that will face us in even 10 or 15 years' time, let alone 30 to 50 years' time, which is what Lord Robertson pointed out will be the time when this new Trident fleet is deployed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are questions addressed to the speakers, they will address them in their concluding remarks. Another speaker, please. I'd like to take, not a man, somebody other than a man. If we've got some women in the audience who'd like to ask a question. Yes, there's a lady there.
Do I stand up or do I sit down? Oh, yeah, I don't. I just wondered, forgive me if this is a very ignorant question, but I just wondered if we in the United Kingdom receive a warning of an impending nuclear attack and we have Trident at our disposal, whatever that means now, what would be our chances of winning? I just wondered. I mean, would it be a complete...
I'll leave that with both speakers to address that one, but I can guess what Rebecca's answer might be. Yes, there's a gentleman there, yes.
Yeah, my name's Gary Say. I used to be a student at the War Studies many, many years ago. The issues, the moral issue is something that's been well covered, I think. The issue of deterrence, I have problems with, in that I could understand the deterrence when you had the idea of sensible, logical states who also had nuclear weapons, and you could deter them under the mutually assured destruction concept. But increasingly now, the threat is likely to come from either rogue states who are slightly less logical in their thought processes, or states like Pakistan, whose nuclear weapons could go into the hands of people who aren't even states and threaten people like Britain. So I just wanted to know how our deterrence would work against countries or even non-countries that don't think logically like the Soviet Union used to do. The other issue that I think hasn't really been addressed is the issue of the effect of Trident replacement on the overall military defence budget in the future. We're building aircraft carriers that haven't got any aeroplanes because we can't afford the aeroplanes, and the previous government went ahead without even thinking that, and one of those aircraft carriers is now actually going to be put in mothballs. So again, increasingly, the sort of issues we face, like Libya and that, where we didn't have an aircraft carrier, the French did, are not things we can deal with, because the money is now going to be used up for Trident systems rather than conventional systems that should not even be facing other countries now, should be facing non-country threats. So I just don't see how, in the modern day and age, how this deterrence is now effective.
Another important set of questions for the speakers to answer. You don't have to frame what you say in the form of a question. I'll take somebody from this side. Somebody right at the back, I think, a young man at the back.
Hello, my name's James. I was just wondering on the practical question of what happens when Scotland gets independence. How does it get divided if we've renewed it, or do we keep it all? Yeah.
Right, and somebody on this side, the gentleman here.
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst with Customs and Excise who worked for some years with law enforcement agencies in the former Soviet countries, and I declare an interest. Like Lord Robertson, I was brought up on the Firth of Clyde. My father was a civilian engineer on the Polaris boat program in the 1960s, and my job in Kiev was made a lot easier because my FBI attaché counterpart in the embassy was an ex-US Navy man from the Holy Loch. My question is based on a remark I heard earlier before the meeting, and it's not surprisingly addressed to Ms. Johnson, so I think you can see which side I'm on, that a gentleman suggested that nuclear deterrence is a profoundly immoral approach because it basically, well, it's not basically, it does threaten to kill innocent civilians. Can I make, what's your comment, Ms. Johnson, on the rather brutal, but I think probably tragically accurate belief that during the conflict in Northern Ireland, it's probably a brutal fact of life that large numbers of people who are now dead as a result of that conflict would have been alive if the hard fact of life was that the Ulster Volunteer Force had had a credible capability, credible if you can use that term, capability to mount a sustained bombing campaign in the Irish Republic. The brutal fact of life is that the Irish government would probably, after a sustained series of attacks, there were attacks, of course, in the 1970s, but not on a sustained basis, that they would have agreed, look, we have to take draconian measures to end this. In other words, a deterrence, I know a tragic attitude of terror against civilians would nonetheless have saved many lives, Catholic and Protestant, North and South, and in mainland Britain. So an immoral threat would nonetheless have had a practical result, although perhaps for the wrong reason.
Slight change of format, because we've had so many interesting and very important questions actually addressed to the panellists. I'm just going to ask them to pick up some of those questions now before they're lost, because some very important questions. Let's begin with Lord Robertson.
Well, just a handful of these points. The gentleman asked about rogue states. I think we have to deal with a range of risks in the future. Nuclear deterrence does not deal with every risk. But what we have to remember is that throughout the centuries, this world was plagued by interstate conflict. The last century, and it's not all that long past, we had 2 world wars, which were between countries. 50 million people died in the Second World War before a nuclear bomb was exploded. That was the level of casualties that took place there as well. So we're not in a position to make a judgment as to whether or not inter-country conflict could or might come back. So that when you're looking for evidence, we've had 60 years without interstate conflict, without any of the parties who traditionally over the centuries went to war in order to solve conflicts, whether they were border conflicts or conflicts between the countries, economic or otherwise. And that has got to have an ingredient of the nuclear deterrent involved in it. We can't simply say that it's by coincidence or that everybody learned a lesson and people gave up interstate war. There has to be some ingredient there, and nuclear weapons clearly are among it. It affects the calculation of countries who believe that they can resolve differences between themselves by an act of war. So although you can't eliminate the problems of terrorism and the rest of that, you can certainly prevent states from thinking that they can harbour terrorists or through terrorism gain domination over other countries. Nuclear deterrence has got a role in pacifying some of the reckless elements in an international community that has known recklessness in the past to the point of the elimination of huge numbers of people as well. The effect of Trident on the military budget. Well, of course, any system that you build within the military budget will affect other parts of that. And there are people here who used to manage the budget for me in the Ministry of Defence. But over the lifetime of Trident, the calculation is still that it's about 3% of the defence budget. In certain stages of expenditure, it will have an effect, but then that applies to aircraft carriers, it applies to fast jets, and to other major items of expenditure as well. But if you believe that there is a role for nuclear deterrence in the world, then you have to spread the cost over those years, and it is not a crippling cost for this country. Whereas to remove that ingredient of deterrence from the equation, I think, would be much more costly. The guy at the back mentioned Scottish independence. Well, I'm not contemplating that taking place. I'm sure it's difficult to tell from my accent where I come from in the United Kingdom. But let us say the people of Scotland, as they are perfectly entitled to in 2014 or earlier, vote for Scotland to be a separate state, then the status of Faslane and the thousands of jobs involved in the Clyde submarine base there would clearly be a matter of negotiation between the independent Scottish Government and the United Kingdom. So people should not make an automatic assumption that an independent Scotland would be a free agent in terms of the legacies that it would either inherit or the legacies that it might want to pass on to the rest of the United Kingdom as well. And I think it's a facile argument for people to say, here's the shortcut to unilateral nuclear disarmament. We will simply vote for independence in the referendum. It will be much more complicated and much more messy than that, as indeed the Russians found in respect of their military base in Sevastopol in the south of Russia. That was a difficult negotiation to take place, and the Russians are still in Sevastopol, which is in the independent Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And Rebecca, would you like to respond to anything?
Yes, thank you. Julian asked about which nuclear or near-nuclear country would give up. And I think my argument made very clear that if we're going to be realistic about these things, they don't just happen in a linear, sequential way. We don't 1 minute give up and then the next minute somebody else gives up. That isn't the real world. But there's been some very, very interesting studies through Harvard University's Managing the Atom program and others, and some case studies, very detailed, on the decision-making in countries like Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Sweden, South Korea. I just came back from a meeting in Brussels where we were looking at this issue, looking at what was the decision-making that pushed them into renouncing nuclear weapon programs, or giving up, in fact, relinquishing nuclear weapons in the case of South Africa. And what comes through is that regardless of what the public announcement they make, which often was dressed up like in terms of security, the real reasons had to do with domestic change. Domestic change towards greater democratization, as we saw with Argentina and Brazil. Domestic change, getting rid of apartheid, as we saw with South Africa. Domestic change also in terms of how the country perceives its security and its needs and its own role and identity. So the role of civil society plays a role in this. And other institutions like the European Union also play roles in these. Now, if Britain, just in the same way that Britain's reducing our numbers did not, we were engaging in a discourse that, maybe made some sense for, shaving off the costs for, the British public to find it more palatable. But it didn't have much influence on the other nuclear weapon states or nuclear armed states, and it certainly did not have the desired effect that people like Lord Robertson spoke of on other proliferators or potential proliferators, because that's not how it works. However, if we were to clearly state that we're not going to replace Trident, and then we recognize, and let's think about the process that we'd be undertaking. This would not be an overnight thing. And the first thing is that if we're saying we're not going to replace Trident, actually we should probably take the Trident we have off deployment. We don't need to have it wandering around the oceans, running into the French, playing their nuclear games. I make a joke about this, but it actually was a very serious collision and potentially a very serious accident. So we need to then take them out of deployment. But then there is a process during which physically weapons will exist while we are engaging very, very fully to amplify the arguments why no country needs nuclear weapons, to put in place the legal as well as the political regime that stigmatizes, and indeed, our deterrence would be far better served by a legal regime that absolutely makes clear that any use of nuclear weapons would be a crime against humanity and a war crime. Think about leaders like Saddam Hussein. The last thing he wanted was to be taken in chains to The Hague, to actually be confronted by Iranians that he'd bombed with chemical weapons. So we would create a regime, and that would take a transition time during which we would, for start, still be a nuclear weapon state, because that's the definition in the NPT, but we would be one that would be showing the rest of the world and engaging with others on how you create the verification regime that makes the decision not to go nuclear a much safer decision for other nuclear-armed states, and takes away any of the drivers that could be driving a potential Iranian nuclear program.
And I think we'll take a few questions now.
The context
in
which
Rachel.
that decision will be taken. I'll return to the other questions when there's more time.
We'll give you some more time at the end. Yes, the gentleman at the front there.
David Oman, King's College. I wonder if I might ask for clarification from the two speakers on the following hypothesis. Just suppose after the next British general election, a future government were to say, we're not going to build new submarines. Would they still advocate, or would they say we should continue in NATO, continue to sign up to NATO's nuclear strategy or general strategy, and shelter under the American nuclear umbrella? Or would they think that inconsistent with the decision not to continue with our own deterrent?
Good question. There's a lady there with her hand up.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Kate Dews from New Zealand, and I'm a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. And the Secretary General has a 5-point plan for disarmament, and the first thing he talks about is the need for a nuclear weapons convention. And so I just want to also acknowledge how Britain has led on disarmament and how important that has been in terms of being a model for other countries. And as you know, from New Zealand 25 years ago, we chose to reject nuclear deterrence and come out from under the nuclear umbrella, and to some extent joined with countries like South Africa and others to become a leader on disarmament issues. I would like a comment on two things. One, could the money that has been potentially going into Trident replacement be used to follow on from your disarmament leadership in terms of verification and transparency, and also putting money into creating dialogue between states that are in conflict and looking at how to solve those conflicts non-violently, to use the International Court of Justice. And the question I would like from both panellists, please, is what would be a legal use of a nuclear weapon in terms of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion from 1996? Because when I last asked Sir Michael Quinlan this question here 4 or 5 years ago, his answer to me was that it would be a naval base in Murmansk, and my memory was that the Cold War had ended quite a while ago. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a gentleman up here. No, just behind. About there.
Yeah. Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. Having been opposed to all nuclear weapons everywhere since they were first unleashed on the world, not having changed, having taken that position since significantly earlier than George's so-called youthful indiscretions, and still maintaining it today, what I want to do is challenge the basic terminology. An aside, first of all, gentleman over there referred to the nuclear umbrella. I prefer nuclear storm cloud. However, the crucial point is this word deterrent and deterrence. There is a fundamental contradiction in that word and its use. Any weapon may be a deterrent, but it is can only be a deterrent if there is a realistic prospect of it being used. And of course, if the so-called nuclear deterrent were used, it has not been a deterrent. This is absolutely fundamental to every argument, and it is the only way that the defenders of nuclear weapons can ever actually get acceptance of it. The morality, the expense and all the other arguments about it come in only if you can get rid of that one word and have a realistic discussion. Who is it going to deter? Does the deterree actually have the same understanding of the situation? There is no evidence whatsoever that any of the 200 or so armed conflicts which have taken place since 1945 have actually been deterred by the possession of nuclear weapons. And Rebecca made a lot of good points. But the other... just
I think if you could begin to wind up,
yes,
there's a lot of people wanting to get in.
One other point, of course, this is a very narrow debate, and what we need to have is much wider debate about the whole international situation. George, for example, in saying that there have been no interstate conflicts, which is not true anyway, Vietnam, Korea, and lots of others, but he doesn't say anything about the establishment of the United Nations as a means of developing a more peaceful world, which is a rather important omission.
And there's a young man right at the back. I'm sorry, there are a lot of hands up, and I'm not going to be able to get everybody in.
Hi, thank you. My name's Matthew Harries. I'm a student at King's. Rebecca, you talked about two discourses, one based on deterrence and one based on the delegitimisation of nuclear weapons. And you talked about the fact that those two discourses are separate. And I was worried by that, because I would argue that a lot of the momentum behind multilateral disarmament in the last 5 years has been because of an effort to bring those discourses closer together. And I think some of the value of the Four Horsemen article was that it allowed people who do believe in nuclear deterrence to participate in a debate about disarmament that's more constructive than the debate that's happened over the last few decades. And I'd argue further that multilateral disarmament can only really be successful if it is willing to speak the language of deterrence, and it is willing to demonstrate that deterrence is possible at low numbers of weapons, and it can eventually be replaced by conventional means or other political means. And lastly, that the rejection of that argument out of hand, and the argument that deterrence is fundamentally illegitimate, runs the risk of, for better or for worse, being rejected as fundamentally not serious. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman right at the back there.
Derek Gregory is the name, a private attendee of war studies. Just supposing an attacker did send a bomb via missile over here, does he not think that it wouldn't be the end of everything? Supposing he sent 2 or 3 or 4 bombs and wiped 2 or 3, 4 cities, does he not realise that others, the United States or Europe, Australia, everywhere else in the world, wouldn't just stand by? Or would they? I don't think they would. I think the consequences to him would be just unthinkable, and I don't think he would send it over to us in the first place. So in that case, let's forget about the submarines and the weapons and save our money. Finished.
David, did you want to get...
I just want to... Sorry, David Fisher, also King's College. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on Rebecca's moral argument, which I think underlay a lot of what she said, and I think rightly so, because I think that the moral issues are an important part of this question. You suggested at the end, Rebecca, that it would be the moral decision because it would help reduce the risk of nuclear incineration. Now, I guess everybody, and I think you acknowledge this on both sides of the argument, want to avoid nuclear incineration. And this is what makes this such a difficult question. Of course, nuclear deterrence is presented with enormous moral problems. Nuclear use would risk breaching the just war principles of proportion and discrimination. But the moral difficulties aren't on just one side of the argument. They are also on the other side. If the stable democracies give up their nuclear weapons, and we're left in a world where only the dictators have nuclear weapons, that might actually increase the risk of nuclear use, since there would no longer be any restraint exercised through deterrence. And we're talking here of a world in which, therefore, Iran, North Korea might still have weapons, but the Western democracies would have given them up. Is that really going to be a safer and better world? It's a key moral virtue to actually act prudently. Indeed, Aristotle says that prudence, you cannot be good without prudence. And it would seem to me a somewhat imprudent step to yield to dictators this enormously, almost infinite weapon, while the West gives it up. So it does seem to me the moral arguments aren't, the moral difficulties aren't on just one side of the question.
There's a gentleman here been trying to get in, and then I'll come over there.
Thank you, Chairman. Gordon Wilson, Associate Fellow at the Department of War Studies and a Fellow at RUSI. I'm about to address some comments to Dr. Johnson, if I might. I think, Dr. Johnson, I would say some of your arguments are flawed, I think, and perhaps emotional. I do hold a red card up to your saying it's a 19th century imperial mindset. It is not. It's come out of a legacy of what was left over at the end of the Second World War. And to use something like that as your argument is flawed. Also, even to bring up the incident between the French and the British boats. It is a one-off thing that happened. It is totally an undesirable element. It is one-off, never happened again. It makes no difference to the theory about nuclear deterrence. That is just an incident between boats. I think your idealistic approach on that, it's been covered quite a lot, that if we give it up, it doesn't make anybody else will jump on the bandwagon. They just sort of shrug their shoulders and get on with their business. Michael Quinlan's comment about if you didn't have it, you wouldn't get it, well, that stands to common sense. Not only is the weapon systems and it's the whole infrastructure, but it's enormous. Anyway, you'd be going against a non-proliferation treaty if you started up, so you couldn't do it. And that's sort of, I don't think that's an argument against it. And the four nuclear evangelists, if you like to call Sam Nunn and Kissinger and co., they're only four, and you've heard, for example, here how someone went in the other direction. So in their four minds, they're not necessarily the arbiters of the whole argument.
Yeah. I think, if you don't mind, I think if we could ask people just to make one point, and only make it if it hasn't been made already. This gentleman getting down.
Thank you. Alistair Rosenshine. I was formerly a student in war studies here. My question's for Dr. Johnson. Can you give me some examples from history where weak nations have deterred aggressor nations? And how does weakness guarantee freedom? Thank you.
And the gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Changi Sarosh. A simple question. Us having the nuclear weapons, does it deter others from having them or encourages them?
And there's a young man halfway up there.
Hello, Ben Turner, War Studies alumnus. I think that it's right to say that if there was an attack on Britain in any way today that merited a nuclear response, we probably could count on allies in NATO to defend us. But I think we're in a world now where that's becoming increasingly less the case. Can we count on America being that kind of power in 20 or 30 years' time, or will they be more concerned about their own wider security interests?
Thank you. Any more ladies? Yes, there's one here who's got a question. Yeah.
Louisa Poole, CCADD. I just want to make a very small point in connection with the statement Dr. Johnson made about the countries that are describing why they have not taken up nuclear weapons. The whole point about the Trident being replaced, Trident is a weapon. So we're talking about, in this instance, I think, how effective it is as a defense of security. And if you're defending security in one situation, it's really not like another. My only experience of this is in dealing with snowball fights in school playgrounds. And one of the things I was very aware of, that the most important strategic decision to be made was not how many snowballs you got made, but where you were going to throw them. What was the objective? So if you have to be effective, you throw them where the most other people are. You do not throw them randomly hoping to hit something. So the idea being, in my mind, is something like, the picture you see on television of the map of the globe where most of the people are placed, really has a very different decision to make, I think, about all of this than countries which have a much more sparsely spread population to deal with. So it's just something about the effectiveness of the weaponry really changing depending on where you're living and the area that you are trying to defend.
And you're going to take a couple of very quick questions, and we can't get everybody, but there's a gentleman halfway up there.
Roy Hemmings, ex-Army chaplain and CCADD. My main point is, 2 points very briefly. Rebecca's idealism appeals also to my youthful banner waving, especially on humanitarian law and the criminal court in the future, and also deterrence. But I doubt very much if anybody will follow us. I have a very practical concern with the, I think, two threats to the future: asymmetric warfare, which she mentioned, to which I do wonder, could we ever use nuclear weapons against it? And the other point is proliferation. Everybody talks about non-proliferation, but I suspect that within the next decade there will be other nuclear powers in the Middle East, probably on Sunni and Shia sides, different sides. What would our one submarine do against that? My points really also, I think, are reflected in our failure to do very much about the war crimes now in Syria.
I think there's a gentleman there sorry, that'll have to be the last one, because we just give them time just to wind up.
Lord Robertson, my name is Robert Green. I'm a former nuclear weapon operator, ex-commander Royal Navy, and I'm afraid over the years I too have changed my mind, and that is that what I was asked to do wouldn't work. And I believe that you were a member of an administration once that professed to be wanting to be a force for good. And so I would like to put to you that I believe Sir Michael Quinlan did once say that his main role, he felt, was to provide intellectual clothing for what was essentially a very basic political gut decision, and that decision was really to do with status vis-à-vis France, and that the real problem for this Trident replacement debate is that little Englanders cannot contemplate France being the only European nuclear power. And I would feel that really we ought to rise above that and even invite the President of France to join us in standing down SSBN patrols and moving together towards a nuclear weapon-free world. It would have enormous influence. This would be sensational. I would like your comment.
Right. I'm going to ask Rebecca to please to speak for not more than 4 minutes, Lord Robertson to speak for not more than 4 minutes, to address any of those questions or anything else you want to say.
Well, I want to thank you all for some very interesting questions. I'd actually expected that, as this was a debate, that more of you would be putting your own arguments into the mix. But since you've made some questions, let me clarify a few things, because although I certainly don't dismiss the moral argument, I think I made clear from the very beginning that I think that a moral argument can be made on both sides. So it's not the clincher. This is not a debate between bad people and good people. That's not how it works. And that's why the case that I made was preeminently a security case. I'm amused that people keep saying, Rebecca Johnson's idealism and things like that. The fact is, I'm a pragmatist. I care about security. I care about preventing the use of nuclear weapons. I'm much more interested in preventing the use of nuclear weapons, whether by accident, and the fact is accidents happen. You cannot predicate your building of certain kinds of technologies unless you take into account how you would deal with the situation if accidents happened, whether those accidents were the things we were afraid of in the Cold War, such as miscalculation and setting off a war, or any other kind of computerized or bad command. I think that those kinds of accidents are much less likely to happen now, at least between some countries, but they are still, like, I spent several hours about 3 days ago with the Pakistani ambassador, and I'm very aware of how those accidents are still very likely to happen in some place of the world. But I made my argument on the basis that the prudent thing to do for our security as Britain, as well as the appropriate way to begin the change that we all say we want, but that we actually have to begin to start changing the structures of our military, our political reliance on certain kinds of weapons, our political reliance, and this is why I mentioned the 19th century, on this notion of punching above our weight, of having freedom of action around the world. These things can lead us into military adventurism that makes us less secure. But at rock bottom, the case I made, and I come back to it because I haven't got much time, is the case based on the problems and the flaws with deterrence. Faith-based deterrence is all that we're really clinging to. But deterrence is not a property or an attribute of any particular weapon. It is a relationship between adversaries. It has many components, and communication, psychology, shared values. Do you hold at risk? Somebody mentioned this about population density. Are you a leader that actually cares whether or not your cities are bombed to smithereens? Or are you someone who's gone out of that, is deep down a tunnel somewhere, and that's not something that's going to deter you? These are parts of the relationship of deterrence. And my key point is, even if it might have played a role, and that's absolutely open to debate and argument, in the Cold War, I think it is self-evident, and I think it was evident to Kissinger, it's evident to me, it's evident to quite a lot of people here, it's self-evident increasingly by those that are not clinging to voodoo and faith, that deterrence ain't what it used to be. Nuclear deterrence as a whole, we still need to rely on. But having the nuclear component in it means that if part of that deterrence fails, what we face, and indeed if we have an accident, what we face is catastrophic or potentially catastrophic. And that is why the sensible thing for this government to do would not only be not to replace Trident, but not to do it by default. Not replace Trident by default because we can't afford it. That would be really, we would be a laughing stock, and that's probably what a lot of countries are expecting us to end up doing. But not to replace Trident on the grounds that there are far better tools for deterrence, far better tools for our security, and a far better way of us to restructure our security to deal with the very real threats that we face. Now, if we did that, then we would be doing it in such a way as to influence the calculations and the security decision-making of other countries. Not in a simplistic way, but by changing the way that countries relate to each other, dealing with the kinds of military and weapons that they can get access to and that they would want. And I think that that is worth trying to do, given that we have a situation at present where it's not just the possibility of slow proliferation, drip, drip, if in certain regions, if Iran, for example, does pursue nuclear weapons, we could potentially see that cascade of proliferation. Our nuclear weapons do not stop that happening. Our arguments for deterrence not only don't signal the right kinds of signal to other countries, they potentially, and I only say potentially because I also don't take the argument that what we say has an automatic reaction in other countries either. But what we do, combined with our joining with others who want to devalue nuclear weapons, delegitimize the role of nuclear weapons in deterrence policies, and get a much stronger anti-proliferation and disarmament regime being put in place, that is worth a try.
Thank you very much, Rachel and George, if you could.
Thank you. Can I just say thanks to CAD and to King's College for hosting this meeting. It's a huge, enormous issue, and it may well be one of the critical issues of the next general election. And it's good to have this kind of debate and this kind of discussion. And I always, after years and years in politics, measure the success of a meeting by how many people escape during the meeting. but this audience has remained remarkably intact, which I think reflects the importance of the issue, and maybe not the quality of the argument from the stage. But I too want a world without nuclear weapons. There is something quite awesome and terrible about the power of nuclear weapons, as indeed it is of chemical and biological weapons as well. Let's not sort of make these dividing lines between it. And to have had the responsibility in the Ministry of Defence for the independent nuclear deterrent, within all the safeguards that are built into it, was something that was sobering and worrying at the same time. But the fact is that we haven't found a better way of deterring states from using war as a method of resolving arguments in the world today. And this remarkable period of peace has got to have a lot to do with the fact that nuclear deterrence is still there. Michael Quinlan has been quoted a lot this evening, and this sort of ghost hangs across our proceedings. But I found a quote last night reading one of his books, and he said, "The abhorrence of war is no substitute for realistic plans to prevent it." And that was one of the wise statements of one of the wisest men who agonized over this issue as well. And again, quotations here about Kissinger and Sam Nunn and George Shultz, the four horsemen here. They made it absolutely clear, as one of the students at the back has actually said. They said, as long as nuclear weapons exist, America must retain a safe, secure and reliable nuclear stockpile, primarily to deter a nuclear attack and to reassure our allies through extended deterrence. So that's what they were arguing for, a stage-by-stage multilateral disarmament, de-escalating the reliance on nuclear weapons. That makes sense in the world today. But unilateral disarmament, unconditional disarmament, is actually quite a dangerous technique, which these guys have actually resisted and rejected as well. So Rebecca, in her argument, says she's not arguing about morality. And it's difficult to do that for the reasons I think David Fisher said. If you're preventing something horrible by threatening to do something and you prevent the horrible thing from happening, then there is at least a moral case. She says the case is not based on cost, nor should it be. 3% of the defence budget spread across the 30 years is not a game changer. And she said it's not about losing influence in the world, and nor should it be, because there are bigger arguments there as well. It's all about voodoo deterrence. Well, I don't believe in voodoo, and I don't believe in voodoo deterrence. I simply say we've had a remarkable period of stability in the world, where the great powers in the world have not resorted to using violence against their neighbours in order to resolve disputes. And that has to do with the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, having an undetectable deterrent, unseen, invisible, always there, and therefore inhibiting any action that would take it. And the fact is that India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran and Iraq either have or wanted nuclear weapons, and Israel perhaps has got nuclear weapons. All of them for reasons to do with their own geography, not to do with what the P5 are doing or not doing. And they're not going to be in the slightest bit influenced as to whether or not the British Parliament says we won't continue with the Trident missile system at all. India is scared of Pakistan, and Pakistan's scared of India. Korea is petrified about, North Korea is petrified about Japan. And Iran and Iraq were at each other's throats all of the time, and Israel is in fear of all of its neighbours. They're not going to be affected at all. And the big question here, I think that the unilateralists have got to actually answer is this. And it was put in a way by David Omand is, yes, we're in favour. They are in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament by Britain and stopping the Trident programme. Are they in favour of the United States of America giving up its nuclear weapons? Of America and France giving up nuclear weapons and leaving it to the North Koreans, to the Indians, to the Pakistanis, and to any other country that might choose to do it? That's the big question. Not whether or not we've got an influence. Are we willing to see all the bad guys, the dictators, the proliferators, the expansionists having nuclear weapons when we give them up? 160 million people, as I said, died in conflict in the 20th century. In this coming century, on the basis of present projections, twice as many people as that are going to die on the roads of the world in car crashes. That's the last century and that's this century, and a lot of that has to do with the stability that comes from deterrence. It works. Actually, Rebecca said it, deterrence works. She just wants to remove the nuclear element from deterrence, but you can't do it. You can't disinvent nuclear weapons, or the aspiration by some people, if they could get them and could use them when there was nobody on the other side to do it as well. So yes, we have to continue to search for a better way of running this world. We have to seek better systems of diplomacy and of international institutions that will actually allow people to resolve difficulties without the threat of war or of conflict or of the use of nuclear weapons. But in the meantime, the one factor that has produced stability for these last 60 years is nuclear deterrence, and it would be wholly irresponsible, since we can't see into the future, to do away with it just now and take the decision on behalf of future generations. Thank you.
Well, now before we thank the speakers, which we'll do formally, I'm going to take a vote as I did at the beginning. After that, I'm not going to ask you whether you've changed your mind, because that's too unfair. But I am going to ask you whether, as a result of the discussion this evening, you feel the force of the arguments opposed to the position in which you entered this room rather more strongly than you did before. Have you felt the force of the opposing arguments more strongly than before you came into this room? But first of all, those in favour of the motion that Trident should be replaced as defined at the beginning of this debate. Those in favour? Pretty large number. And those against? I think, to be fair, I think that the people who think it should be replaced had the greater majority, but by not a very, very big number. Obviously, some more people came in because it was more evenly balanced right at the beginning. Now, I would be interested if you could have a show of hands of people who have, as a result of this debate, have felt the force of the arguments contrary to your own position more strongly than you felt it before. Hands up, please. Good. Well, I think that's a sign of a good debate, that about 40 people clearly had been influenced by this debate. Certainly, I would have put my hand up as well, because I've also seen some things that I did not see before. After I've thanked the speakers, we have some wine available at the back, but I'm not sure who's provided this hospital. Who should we thank, David? It's CAD and War Studies who've jointly provided this hospitality. So thank you for CAD and War Studies for hosting this, for King's for providing the hall, and above all for our two speakers for two very lucid and passionate presentations of their case. I think we've been fortunate to hear both sides of the argument so well put.